Alright, in the interest of not wanting to waste an entire 40-minute video, just note that all of this was written before Return to the Pit came out. In fact, as of releasing this, it is still not currently out. It is still a thing that is currently being leaked. However, based on the leaks, a decent amount of this video is subject to small changes or addendums. I'd actually argue less changes than you might think, but without significant rewrites to footage that's already done, I can't really account for everything and give footnotes for every single little detail that I would change or rewrite or re-explain. Just know that a lot of Return to the Pit's supposed confirmations are not that cut and dry currently based on what we have so far. For the first topic I want to go through, here's some kind of cliff notes of how I interpret the pit to work. We can presume that the real world is in fact the real world and Into the Pit. There are some theories about like, oh, it's all in the pit, or some things where the real world wouldn't be the real world. Any variation that follows that logic has to deal with the fact that the Stitch Wraith looks like the Stitch Wraith and not Jake. When the Stitch Wraith actually does go into the pit in the final stingers, he appears as the little kid Jake, not as the giant metal endoskeleton. Another point that kind of suggests that it's not a true time loop is that Oswald can make choices in the first place. Why would the ball pit that feeds on people's suffering and agony allow people to make choices that wouldn't double down on that? And if it wasn't memory of those things, well, why are there 3 different events that happen with the memories? And obviously the Stitch Wraith arc can't be over yet when Into the Pit occurs because, well, we wouldn't have a pit with magic in the first place, and the Stitch Wraith is still around. Then we get some of the following kind of implications, assuming the rules of the pit aren't completely changed from how they worked in the original short stories. Oswald does not recognize the Freddy Fazbear crew at all. However, in Step Closer and Plush Trap Chaser, Fazbear Entertainment has made a noticeable return and is very popular and successful, all things considered. In fact, Plush Trap Chaser is a fly-off-the-shelves toy. However, like I said, Oswald doesn't recognize them despite being in the same general area as the Stitch Wraith, because the Stitch Wraith has to go everywhere by walking, including to the Freddy's where it finds the Foxy that will be used in the Stingers, the Foxy from Step Closer. Some people point to the Stitch Wraith not having a visible battery pack on its chest, implying that Andrew has to have moved on by this point, but there's a few things that suggest that's not the case, at least in the original Stingers. See, the only time I could find where the battery pack was ever described to glow was when the Stitch Wraith was killing Phineas. That was a moment where active supernatural energy was flowing and powers were being used. This also happens with Eleanor later. Her pendant is almost always described as silver, except for one moment where it turns red as she's gearing up to attack. The agonized parts that Andrew and Jake have collected as the Stitch Wraith assemble into a red crackling energy that forms Trash Shafton. Almost every single description Larson or another onlooker gives of the Stitch Wraith never mentions the red glow, despite it being pretty prominent in theory if it was always there in the center of its chest. I know the logbook draws it like a glowing LED, but in general the Lady Fizzy and Pinky Pill's art isn't that good at adapting the actual designs of the characters. And not to mention, the battery pack is always there even when Andrew's soul has moved on. It's actually a vital plot point that it gets shot and damaged in the later Stingers. In fact, it's kind of what makes the willpower Jake has so special, that he's able to get all the way to the pit even off the low amount of energy he has. So the battery pack doesn't really mean a lot on its own. But you might be thinking, okay, so when is the pit happening and how does the pit itself work? Is it time travel? Is it not? It might be more accurate to say that the ball pit is like magical reality alteration, just in a special way. If something is changed in the pit will try to change the real world to line up with that. The best explanations of this are stuff like the paper pals or the hammer and all that. When the pit changes something, the real world gets altered in turn. However, there is one clean example of the other way working around too. Regardless of which world you're in, the vending machine will update in turn as if they were one vending machine with the exact same stock. You get the retro game device in the future, it will skip to the next item in the past. If this was time travel, that doesn't make a lot of sense, and this game put a lot of effort into how it works. Not to mention, your phone still works in the past when there should be no phone signal. And if you try to call your mom, a phone number that shouldn't exist in the past because you're calling her cell phone, creates the Eleanor minigame. And if you rapidly click on the gumball machine, it will put you into the Count the Ways minigame. What I think is happening here is that the pit can't actually account for everything that can happen. So when certain weirder interactions happen, such as the vending machine not having any items to summon or give anymore, or calling a phone number that doesn't exist too many times, or trying to interact with a gumball machine too many times, it sort of freaks out and cuts a hole into the pit's, I don't know what to call it, mainframe, membrane, maybe something similar with how FNaF 3's minigames work, where you click on or interact with objects and that summons the minigames. Basically, it's just a pocket dimension that influences the real world in turn, and is a really accurate recreation of 1985, with maybe some alterations, though we can't really be sure of what those are. While it's not directly stated for Sarah and this kid and Fetch, we do know from the stingers that Millie was definitively in the pit, and given that the Fetch kid dies in this very same building, and Sarah is killed by Eleanor, who is extremely linked to the pit in the stingers, to the point where she functions almost like a tracking beacon for it, it makes it seem like that all three of these victims are in the pit at this point, and that's why you can interact with them in the pit world and only there. Further corroborating what I suspected about the Stitch Wraith earlier, that we are still before Andrew has left, because we don't have any victims past these three. So that's I would have to go back through the stingers to try and tally up who dies where to see how many we would get by the time Andrew leaves. But regardless, what's interesting about this list of 3 characters is that they're all characters who can die irrespective of where they are in the timeline. Eleanor is just kind of stumbled upon. The Funtime Freddy Millie interacted with wasn't in an active Freddy's location of any kind. And Fetch occurs while the 1985 Freddy's is still an abandoned building. Whereas, as I said before, Out of Stock and Step Closer both specifically hinge on the company being active and producing merchandise. I also suspect that these 3 minigames are meant to explain to us how the pit is currently working. We know that Pit Trap is somewhat accounted for because he quotes Andrew from the Stingers in his dialogue lines, and he also kind of quotes Afton, suggesting that he is formed from either of them or both of them, something like that. Yet the 3 active animatronics we have are interesting because it's implied they have something more to them than just being random monsters in the pit. Most specifically, in the trapped ending, we are taken leftwards by Pit Trap as we slowly forget who we are, and the animatronics are now friendly to us. Oswald specifically questions, "Who do they think I am?" And it's also right in front of Pirate's Cove where his eyes glow and whatever is going on is sort of complete and the minigame fades out. It's also worth noting that Oswald's pretty definitively dead in this moment because we can hear Pit Trap biting into him right before this scene starts up. This is specifically when you fail the QTE against him at the end of the game. I suspect that as a claimed victim, Oswald in this ending is turned into the missing animatronic of this current set, that being Foxy. Oswald can be turned into Foxy. That then implies the other 3 could have been something similar. And we have 3 minigames. And the fact that there are only 3 is interesting because we know this game had a very healthy, lengthy development cycle. They probably could have made 4 or 5 or how many victims they wanted the pit to have. If it was just random memories and not souls actively in the pit currently, and if this was meant to be after Andrew had moved on, there should be a lot more going on here. But we can also get marginally more specific on when Into the Pit occurs relative to the mainline games. For the Stitch Wraith storyline to occur, Man in Room 1280 has to have occurred. Man in Room 1280 is 2 years after the fire that occurs in FNaF 6. Since Fetch occurs in a point where this is still an abandoned building and has Fetch still in there, specifically one linked to Andrew, that's actually vital lore because the battery pack in the Stitch Wraith is from Fetch, and Jeff's Pizza was stated to be like a pancake restaurant prior to being Jeff's Pizza, and had to be the closed Freddy's before that even, it means a significant amount of time has passed, enough that multiple hands could have changed for who owns this restaurant. So we are probably over 2 years, unless the Big Bear Pancake House or whatever it was called only lasted 1 year or something. However, like I said, we have to be before the return of Fazbear Entertainment in Help Wanted in the Security Breach era, or at least those have to be in early or unfinished development if the VR game is in development at all yet. Okay, you got all that? Because this is relevant, I swear, because Golden Freddy is seen in the Fetch minigame, implying that there is a Golden Freddy still active 2 years after the events of FNaF 6. It's worth remembering, this is how FNaF 6 ended for most characters. So somehow, some way, this damn yellow bear has persisted past that, which is why I'm going to jankily segue over to the week before, the latest Choose Your Own Adventure featuring Ralph the Phone Guy, leading up to his demise in FNaF 1. There's plenty of good lore in this book. For example, we get a pretty thorough understanding of who Phone Guy is as a person and in the company, which really helps for the greater context of the first 3 games in the modern lore. But what matters a little bit more to the fandom right now, and what's kind of lit everyone on fire, is one particular scene. In one scene, you can choose to dial 1983. Then you hear a supernatural audio playing remaking The Great Bite, which is the FNaF 4 bite. During this moment, we can hear a child crying before the big old chomp. And what's interesting is what happens after the phone call part ends. The crying continues even after that phone call ends. When Ralph turns around, an animatronic bites him and kills him. And yeah, it is an alternate ending / death, but FNaF tends to have most of its alternate endings as canonically possible, just not what specifically did happen. Like, there is a version of Sister Location where Mike goes into the private room and ignores Elizabeth. He didn't choose to do that, but he could have. In this case, he could have called the number, but he canonically didn't because this isn't how he died. Since the crying continues into the real world, it implies the crying child is still active in the 90s and at least has influence over one character, or one character acts on his behalf. Given it's the audio from Fredbear's bite and it's the bite victim referencing his death in the first place, there's a strong case for this being Fredbear / Golden Freddy, especially since this audio doesn't really have anything to directly do with the other four. Which means for the first real time in the series, we have pretty definitive proof of the crying child controlling at least one tangible animatronic prior to about half the series, which eliminates a good chunk of timeline. For example, I made a previous video about Mike being the dormant host of the crying child's soul after he died, sort of being haunted or followed by him until Mike gets injected with a remnant, thus kinda shooting the crying child back to life and making his soul active again. That theory can't fully be the case now without moving Sister Location around to be before FNaF 1. To me, that is a huge boon to theories like Golden Duo, where both the crying child and Cassidy possess Golden Freddy. Though I would be remiss if I didn't mention Shatter Victim. There's quite a few variations and derivatives of Shatter Victim, some more literal than others, but typically the idea is that the bite victim is somehow split across or has a link to all characters, and that by assembling all characters in Happiest Day, you effectively literally put him back together to free him and all other souls. In my opinion, Shatter Victim's in a bit of a weird place. Not to compare the quality to something like the theory that Gregory in Security Breach is a robot, but it does have a unique sort of obnoxious advantage that theory also had, which was there's not really an easy point for the story to prove it wrong. If we elaborately were shown bite victim possessing Golden Freddy, that would just be an example of him possessing one of the 5 characters or being linked to one of the 5 characters he always would have possessed under Shatter Victim. There's not really an incentive for the writing or characters to directly say, oh yes, he's only linked to this one character, much like there's not really an easy opportunity to prove Gregory isn't a robot without doing something gory or intense. So yeah, technically Shatter Victim is still on the table. I'm personally leaning it against it, but I should still mention it. With that in mind, Into the Pit showing Golden Freddy being active in the present / pseudo-future is interesting, as it means somehow Fredbear persists regardless of what happened prior. Now you might say this is a new Fredbear spirit, and while I can't solidly debunk that, there is something that kind of steps in the way of this some. See, let's take a look at the ending of Ultimate Custom Night with 3 particular branched options. The by far most popular general consensus here on YouTube, and I would say for a lot of the fandom because of the influence that YouTube has, is that this is Cassidy as the vengeful spirit, unable to move on as they are tormenting William. That concept has been talked about quite a bit on YouTube, including on my channel, so we're not really going to be talking about that avenue. Another common interpretation used by those who do not believe Cassidy is the vengeful spirit is arguing that this is Cassidy moving on. However, I don't think that's the case for a variety of reasons, even if Cassidy is not the vengeful spirit. See, while I'm fine with things being different on occasion for visual metaphors and representation, this is outright antithetical to how moving on was ever explained elsewhere in the series. In FNaF 3, the visual for souls having moved on was the lights going out in the masks and them all slowly falling to the ground inanimate. In the novels, it's the amalgam being consumed by the fire before melting and becoming still in it, and the souls moving on into light. The whole moving on to light thing also basically happens with Andrew in the Fazbear Fright Stingers. Having glowing eyes while the suit twitches and ominous music plays while the barely audible embers of the fire still crackle in the background is pretty antithetical to what moving on is supposed to be. If it is, it's a really odd way to represent that concept. Especially when, later in the timeline, we will have an active Golden Freddy again, who looks the same way that Golden Freddy has always looked by all accounts. I think that the barely audible embers are meant to tell us that even when 6 and UCN happened, Golden Freddy was still out there somewhere, or at least a Golden Freddy somehow. It can't really be Andrew without Andrew being Golden Freddy or something like that, because Andrew won't be split apart until the events of Man of Norm 1280 conclude 2 years after the fire. So for Golden Freddy to still be there while the fires are going out would imply this is some other spirit who just managed to dodge or not be consumed by the flames. And since the bear looks the same as it always has, it would have to be Cassidy or some other spirit in that suit. This plays into a theory I've had for a while and talked a fair bit about, which was nicknamed Molten MCI Alter-est. The idea that 4 of the missing kids are in Molten Freddy, but not the final 5th one in the form of Cassidy, or theoretically the crying child attached to Golden Freddy as well, if that was the way the story was going. Something that now seems to be paying off in the form of the Fetch minigame, where we see Golden Freddy still out there. And also something that in retrospect might have been implied by Ultimate Custom Night's ending. I think part of the direction of the story right now is that Cassidy is kind of the one who got away, the one that the fire didn't fully account for. I've also mentioned this before in a few videos that I'm not sure how much Henry understands about the greater timeline, especially characters like Golden Freddy who aren't as traditional or easy to understand. Mainly because there's no physical proof of Golden Freddy being left behind in the FNaF 1 location where Follow Me occurred, and in Help Wanted there was Easter eggs showing 4 classic FNaF 1 style endoskeletons in the furnace, which also left Golden Freddy unaccounted for. And in Henry's big dramatic connection terminated monologue, the souls that are accounted for in Henry's monologue are Charlie, Gabriel, Fritz, Susie, and Jeremy. Elizabeth is also accounted for in the monologue, and obviously William is as well. However, anything to do with Golden Freddy is completely absent from most of that game and that diatribe. But you might be wondering, how does that help us narrow down really anything about the story? Well, the thing is, other than 6, I don't really know where else Happiest Day could occur. In Happiest Day, Charlie's mask is the final one that goes down, which means at whatever point in the story Charlie is no longer around in any way, shape, or form, is the point where Happiest Day has already occurred, assuming it wasn't retconned out of the story entirely. That automatically marks off Security Breach, as there's no lights on in the puppet's mask in the Tangle. That also means the Tangle can't be where the souls have gone, because once again, without changing how Happiest Day works, she isn't there anymore. She does stick around a little bit into the Frights plotline in the Stitchline stingers, however the mask is a charred remains that just lets out one final wail before going down. That to me feels more like a workaround with her being the final mask to drop slowly than a, oh, she is still an active part of the story at this point. Until we're shown all 5 original characters still up and running, they should be obliterated. Hell, we can't even use the excuse that their costumes are still out there, because 3 also had a fire where they should have all been basically entirely obliterated. Or at least there should be so little remaining of them that it shouldn't matter anymore. So to still have Happiest Day where a Fredbear spirit moves on, and still have a Golden Freddy out there completely intact seemingly, would suggest that in spite of Happiest Day, somehow that suit can persist. And to me, that makes it sound like Golden Freddy has 2 souls, one that moved on in Happiest Day, and one that just continued to exist in spite of it. And obviously the easiest secondary soul Golden Freddy could have would be the Bite Victim. The Bite Victim whose entire narrative and story in many ways revolves around Happiest Day. Countless visuals leading up to the day he was bitten are about Happiest Day. The destroyed Mangle toy, the toy Chica on the grass, the kid with the balloon, the shadow of Bonnie on the wall, the Fredbear who's gone off at stage and follows kids around. FNaF World at length also makes it entirely clear that Happiest Day is centered around the Bite Victim. Between Glitch Fredbear and Spooky Eyes, we are told that we are leaving breadcrumbs for him to help him find his way. Those breadcrumbs are the Happiest Day minigames where each kid is brought to the party. We are told by Spooky Eyes that once those pieces are found, now that they are in place for him, then he can rest, though he still has to go out there and find them. And in one of the most obscure Easter eggs in the entire franchise, if you save this image of FNaF World Update 2's teaser, open it with Notepad, and then go all the way down to the bottom, you can find the text, "He put the pieces back together." which means he does successfully find the pieces and put everything back together. At least that was the intent when Update 2 happened, which Update 2 served as the teaser for Sister Location, which does loosely mean that at least at the start of Sister Location's development, Happiest Day and FNaF World were meant to be successful events that did help all of the kids. Given that means there's now 3 games of setup for this event, I don't think it would be made entirely non-canon, as that would make FNaF World entirely irrelevant, and would also mean that pretty much all of FNaF 4 is pointless to an extent, or at least the day section's Easter eggs become nonsense as they only contribute to an event that's not even canon anymore. So I feel like Happiest Day should happen, and if it happens, it really can't be with Cassidy and have Cassidy move on, as, like I said, we need someone to inhabit that suit. And it damn isn't going to be the kid whose entire story was centered around Happiest Day. Of course, it is possible there is future information we just don't have. Maybe we're building to a new, updated version of Happiest Day that's going to happen down the road in the Stitchline adaptation game. But honestly, I consider that a win-win. If we get to definitively see how Happiest Day is meant to work in the new story, that's perfectly fine. But until that happens, I have to assume that there was just one spirit of the classic set that didn't move on. And of that possible roster, there's only really one kid that we have proof of. I mean, there's kind of Charlie, but we would have to assume that her being in the mask and the stingers was her fully being around as an active spirit. But if so, where are the other kids in this moment? The mask falls into a lake, and the next time we'll see it chronologically is in the Security Breach era. And in that era, it doesn't have any life in it. For a series of short stories that are supposed to bridge the gap, you would think they'd cover this, which is kind of why I'm leaning on Happiest Day already happening. We have one moment in FNaF 6 where they could very easily all move on, with maybe a little bit of extra juice in the puppet mask, versus a multi-year long stretch where we aren't shown anything of the sort happening. So once again, we would have to really hinge on there is some big unseen updated Happiest Day that only is going to exist in the updated game continuity. Otherwise, you actually ironically get a problem that was raised with Vengeful Cassidy for the longest time. One of the points against that theory was that Cassidy was essential to Happiest Day and needed to be there for the other spirits to move on and find rest. Yet if that was truly the case, then it makes Cassidy being around even remotely in the modern era just really out of character and asshole-ish, assuming their character was, oh, I'm part of the Happiest Day squad helping everyone move on. I mean, it's possible that multiple people can just be correct in this moment. Cassidy may not be the vengeful spirit, but also may not be a spirit intending to move on right now. I don't know where in the story they would be going after this point, but I think in a weird way that is the intention. We had one spirit who got the sort of original ending in Happiest Day, if that makes sense, just with an updated, tweaked backstory. This would allow future stories to do more interesting things with Golden Freddy than the 1 through 3 Happiest Day timeline could allow. Hell, while I'm still against the princess from Princess Quest being Cassidy, the idea that maybe the Golden Freddy in FNaF AR was the original one is still on the table, because that wasn't really explained very well in that context. And apparently they have some cameo in the Fetch storyline, so it's just possible Cassidy is just a character we haven't seen the full story of yet. But I don't want to just say, hey, this already extremely popular Golden Freddy theory has even more evidence, that's it. I want to look into some of the whys a bit more. See, while I've already argued that Cassidy isn't required to Happiest Day, I also don't think the main 4 kids are required either. This is mainly because in FNaF World with the drowning ending, you can get it without doing the clock ending at all. This scene is called Happiest Day, and when it ends, the game crashes, and the game seems to be related to whatever the bite victim is currently, or at least has an extreme effect on him, which would imply his soul isn't around anymore after you drown yourself. In other words, after this Happiest Day, so he does successfully move on in this moment. Meaning, if the 5 missing kids were required for him to move on, or even just the 4 of them, the visual of at most 3 figures in this minigame is kind of disconnected and against what the main theme would be in theory. I'll get into this a little bit more as we go on, but this already makes me think that whatever Happiest Day is for the bite victim is less about the literal party and more about something the party enables. Something that this scene also enables or fixes about him. And I think we can start chipping away at what that is without Shadow Victim, but still in that kind of realm and wheelhouse. But as with a lot of things in this video, I first want to kind of segue away to another scrapped script. In this case, I had a scrapped video about Sister Location, nicknamed Shattered Elizabeth. Now, the concept behind this video wasn't exactly rocket science, and in hindsight, I don't know why I didn't really go through with it, but in short, something I noticed that was interesting at the ending of Sister Location is how Mike is able to recognize Elizabeth as assembled based on his work. The only thing he actually does in that game is make Ennard, really. We also know that Elizabeth isn't in primary control of Baby in sister location, but is after sister location. Not only does Ennard use Elizabeth's voice in the private room ending, but also she starts talking as if she actually is Elizabeth in 6. So something changed between these two moments. I think it's possible that as part of the usage of the scooper, chunks of Elizabeth's core remnant was taken out bit by bit and put into the initial fun time, maybe as a sort of precursor experiment to Molten MCI or something like that. Thus, by assembling Ennard, technically all of her remnant is back in one place, and thus when Ennard is assembled, Michael can recognize his work as done. William wanted him to create Ennard. Obviously, he wasn't meant to die, or at least if William intended that, he didn't tell Mike, or Mike is just way more selfless than we give him credit, but the end result is the desired end result regardless. Fazbear Frights and novels also riff on this idea. This was the inspiration for Molten MCI in the first place in the fandom. I mean, it kind of existed prior, but what really helped it take form was when we saw in the novels the amalgam being created out of the original animatronics, or Andrew's soul with William infect and spread across all the things in the Fazbear Distribution Center. But what I bring up about all of this is, in William's definition, putting something back together is literally putting it back together. And in the other two instances, once again, it is literally assembling everything that was the prior character back into one place. And also with all of these, they were physically split apart. Dying itself doesn't magically break you. And why that matters is if we flash back to the bite victim's death, you're broken is said before the bite victim dies. Now there are some theories like Cashley Plush Alter M created by Jokiquin that have this event in the present or later timeline that have the plush going back through the bite victim's memories to learn what happened to him. But even if we assume the plush had some sort of special foresight or was talking knowing what will happen later down the road, FNaF World still has him referred to as broken before really anything else we've seen happen. The closest thing we could ever get to seeing the bite victim be broken would be harnessing his memories or whatever we're doing at FNaF World in the clock ending. But he's broken before that, and we know that Spooky Eyes is at least somewhat honest and genuine, because not only does this successfully create Happiest Day down the road, but that teaser I mentioned before about FNaF World Update 2 said he did in fact put the pieces back together. So at least as far as I'm concerned, whatever broken means should refer to some physical event that happened around when he died, maybe even slightly before. Or if he was broken after the fact, it would have to be some visual that exists within what we already have in the lore and story. At least without assuming that something big happened off screen that we were just never shown in any of the games after 4 or even in 4. Instead of splitting him across 5 characters or 4 characters or 6 characters or anything like that, we can simply split him in 2. I mean, not literally down the middle, but think about what we've been told about possession in the series before. Novels have examples such as the pain follows the flesh, as well as describing in detail how Henry's soul was literally poured into the doll he kept from Charlie, and his sorrows and grief of her dying, and his efforts to see her come back, causing literal life to spark in that inanimate object. Now consider how long the bite victim was probably in the jaws of Fredbear after the bite, because he doesn't die there, he dies in the hospital sometime later. I think that when Fredbear bit him, there was so much emotion and memory and feeling poured into Fredbear in that moment, and also probably literal blood and flesh and chunks left behind, that he literally lost a part of himself in that moment. Part of him, in a way, died and was left behind in Fredbear, while the rest of him died in the hospital. 2 halves, both of them unable to move on until they found each other. I think it's best to just kind of walk through FNaF World bit by bit. Spooky Eyes, who can either be Charlie or Cassidy under this interpretation, there's kind of points for both, starts FNaF World by explaining the current problem to the bite victim. Everything out there, the real tangible world, has an effect in here, the world of the spirits. A world that Charlie and the other spirits can see and interact with on some level, but because they are mostly bound, if not entirely bound to their vessels, it's more as an observer or with basic minor influences. And of course, there's the people in the real tangible world like Mike or William. William can obviously do stuff like interact with the world of spirits by tampering with the real actual vessels they possess, but he can't see this. He can't move around something in the FNaF world, for example. In that way, it is a safe place, a sanctuary, but there are limitations to how safe it can really be. Spooky Eyes continues to explain that something went very wrong. I think, quite simply, this has always been intended to be Follow Me. That might also include Molten MCI and the idea of Molten Freddy and the spirits being in him, but Follow Me had very much existed by this point in the story, and I think that was the original target of this line. though it doesn't actually change much. The problem is the animatronics are dismantled and or mixed into Molten Freddy. And since everything out there has an effect in here, which is why this had to be prefaced, this is basically saying now their souls are all jumbled up and messed up as we see in the Happiest Day minigames. To put this in other series terms, this is like what happened in the novels with the Amalgam, where they are taken apart and they become these weird abstract faceless versions of themselves. Now, this is largely riffing on Molten MCI Alteres, but especially in the context of the original Follow Me, where we never saw Golden Freddy dismantled, Golden Freddy is immune to this effect, because it wasn't dismantled. This plays into the next line, I won't let the same happen to you. Half of him is bound to Fredbear. While I don't think it's exactly clear what would happen to the bite victim if the suit was destroyed, I can assume that having half of your soul ripped apart and destroyed wouldn't be good for the other half either, especially if everything out there has an effect in here. And I do think the bite victim of them all does need to be in the best condition. While Charlie is much more sentient than the core 4 kids, and Cassie seems to be on some level as well, both of them possess their vessels more traditionally. I mean, the fact that the story goes out of its way to do this whole elaborate side quest and thing with FNaF World and FNaF 4 fundamentally implies there's something about this kid that needs special attention or work to be done regardless. And I think the purpose of making him this split spirit was to kind of justify that angle some, to create a character in a unique circumstance that no one else exactly had at the time. Being broken up into 2 parts, one that is a free-floating spirit that can go anywhere or any place, while still having enough of a physical tether to still affect the real world and spirits bound to the real world, is a unique advantage that only the bite victim would theoretically have. Thus, it's on him to try and find their spirits and fix them as they are. In the 1 through 4/world timeline, this would refer to how the parts seemingly vanished over time. We know that Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction, had trouble tracking them down and couldn't even tell what was real and what wasn't. This would mean they were literally scattered across the world, meaning it's not really time efficient for Charlie just to go around finding every piece and trying to reassemble them. And it's even worse in the modern timeline where they're all mixed and mashed into Molten Freddy. There's not really a way to just restore them back to their own unique identities anymore. You would probably have to fix something on the soul side of them. Spooky Eyes promises that they will put the bite victim back together, and then starts their plan. They will leave breadcrumbs for him to help him find the spirits. I think these breadcrumbs work by connecting the bite victim's previous experiences to common ground that he shares with the kids in question. They've seen Mangle, they've encountered Toy Chica, they've seen RWQ, they've seen Fredbear, they've seen Balloon Boy, you get the picture. However, the bite victim also, in his own weird way, did see those same things too. He saw a toy of Chica on the ground, he saw a shadow of Bonnie on the wall, he saw a Fredbear off its stage, he saw a kid with balloons. I suspect that FNaF 4 was trying to go for a thing of like, hey, this is how he can relate to them or connect to them. This is something where their 2 minds and worlds kind of overlap some. Whatever Spooky Eyes and Glitch Bear were doing was setting up those series of connections so he could find them. And it's also worth noting the fact that the link has to be made here implies it wasn't prior to this point. Whatever he was, he needed a special set of guiding tools to get him to that point. Now, a handful of times I've seen the clock minigames used to support Shatter Victim, as if these were the points in time where he was specifically shattered across the various kids' souls or suits, depending on your take. My one problem though is the correlation isn't actually that clean for this. Not only is he called broken before we do any of the clock minigames at the very start of FNaF World and also at the end of FNaF 4, but also not every minigame specifically links to one kid. Specifically, Mangle's quest doesn't relate to any one of them. It provides the cake that's used to help all of them, so it does have some correlation to them, but it's not like one kid's soul is the cake, you know? Or one suit is the cake. So if these minigames were supposed to be him being split across each one, what is he being split across in this case? Also, we never do anything for Cassidy, so we would have to assume that he was already attached to Golden Freddy beforehand, or has some already inherent link to Fredbear, which isn't that absurd of a claim. I just would like to point out that he would have to start out as Fredbear or something like that before the events of FNaF World, because we never do anything to define a link between the two. That, or it's similar to Charlie Rules, where Cassie just does not need any help or correlation to Happiest Day, or is not a part of Happiest Day, or something like that. Spooky Eyes reminds the bite victim that these are his friends. Now, while in the original context of the plush, I think this was just a vain, empty thing talking about the plushies. He called them his friend at the start of the game. However, by this point in the series, he's been around the kids so long, and as the week before would later make it evident, was active and around them for quite some time. And we know from the logbook that Cassidy was interacting with him, so we know he wasn't completely alone in this situation. So I would assume they would be his actual friends this late into the timeline. What was once a sign of sadness in his life that he didn't have any real friends now shows how much progress he's made and how much he's actually found in this world. But it also reminds him why this plan is important. After setting the breadcrumbs for him to follow to the other kids, he can retrieve them one by one and repair them. I think what the cake in Happiest Day represents is some sort of missing component to the spirits. Since the 4 missing kids were all dismantled the same way, I suspect that part of why we only have to collect the cake once in the Mangle Quest minigame is because it is just this one thing they're all missing. If they are given it each one by one, they will slowly become what they originally were more and more. I mean, like I said, the animatronics won't magically be repaired, but their souls and minds will be intact once more. Now this is where I say it's bonus points for Charlie, because Spooky Eye says, I will put you back together, and once we've fixed all the kids and they're able to attend the party, it is Charlie as the puppet who gives the final kid the cake. Once again, I think the cake represents whatever the person in question is missing. Charlie has found his Fredbear half, hence why he puts on the mask in this moment upon receiving the cake. The literal 2 halves of him were put together, and being surrounded by his friends allows him to be happy and find enough resolution to move on. To be honest, you can tweak some of the details of this theory to work however you want it to work, though this would explain a lot of the visual quirks and storytelling that goes on in Happiest Day. In all of the minigames except for Happiest Day itself, you are breaking out of the confines of what exists. While in FNaF 3, I think this was just done to be a cool, interesting way for the player to explore the world of the game, I think 4 and World were trying to give a more material, rational explanation to why that would exist that way. He has to sort of break out of what he remembered and what the kids remembered to actually find them in that weird meta space. It would also explain why we shift form and identity across so many characters, given that they're all kind of just frozen in time when we're in the RWQ stage. I suspect they're just kind of inanimate replaying memories on loop that the Boundless Spirit just kind of enters and takes over one of the characters for to do whatever they want. Of course, he doesn't need to break out of the confines of his minigame when it's his minigame. Happiest Day is a mirrored version of Fredbear's Family Diner. The entire visual setup is a mirror of the bite in that moment. That's the moment where he was broken. That was also probably the last thing he saw, considering that he's in this weird black void at the end of FNaF 4, and the version of him that's in the logbook describes how he can't see, though that kind of gets contradicted by the week before where he's still able to manipulate the suit and stuff. You might be able to work Cassidy into this. If you really want this to be Cassidy, it could be part of what I said earlier. His original vessel was Fredbear, so he wouldn't need a special link to get to that suit. I'm sure details would change depending on when in the story this was enacted. But honestly, the whole per game argument becomes really messy and convoluted as the games go on. Like, I think you can get a good chunk of the asymmetrical spirit angle going on, because a lot of the base implications of that are in FNaF 4. He is stated to be broken, and we do see him get bit by Fredbear, and then see him die in the hospital, which, like I said, is the setup for the 2 halves. We do see his memories manifest into FNaF 3's minigame, and we do have a resolution where Golden Freddy is the final component. So, while extremely hard to figure out and esoteric, it is all there. This would create an arc for the bite victim that loosely goes as follows. Granted, there's going to be a lot of fuzzy details here, which I hope will be expanded upon in more material like the week before. In 1983, he will see something, maybe a spring lock failure, maybe just a misunderstanding of something benign. For whatever reason, he will become terrified of the physical animatronics. Mike then starts bullying him for this, and Elizabeth is just generally unhelpful, and William is, well, William. Eventually, these problems escalate to his birthday, on which he will be bit by Fredbear, leaving all his fear, all his suffering, all his agony, as well as a lot of the memory and feeling attached to all of that, and probably some amount of his physical body too, and then the rest of him dies in the hospital. So this would kind of bifurcate his soul, one part that was removed and one part that was left behind. Both of them unable to move on until they found each other. Now, I think he still does function as a one soul/character. Like, both parts are aware of the same information. That's because that typically is how things worked in the Silver Eyes continuity, and kind of how things worked with Andrew, but even then with Andrew it was a little unclear. But I actually don't think that information changes that much. All that really matters for the story is that he needs those 2 parts to be reunited and made whole again. Time passes as the murders happen, and more souls start inhabiting the suits. Potentially Cassidy, I would think so, discovers the part of him stuck in Fredbear. I think this is the kind of information the logbook was trying to convey to us, though exactly when it's happened is still unclear. At some point, I would assume this information gets passed on to Charlie, considering that she seems to be aware of things, at least by the very end. And then... Okay, so now most of the gang is split up into soul soup and now melted down into the clowns in an underground bunker. But don't worry, we have Charlie to fix this! And we don't have Charlie to fix this for some reason. Or do we? That's also still kind of unclear what the hell she was doing for 30 years. Like, was she aware of this? She not? Seems to be aware of it in Happiest Day, but also, like, she was trapped in a robot bear for a while, so what the hell? I mean, at least they killed William, kind of, except for the fact that he's now an immortal rabbit monster. So yeah, nothing's really going great for the spirits in general. Alright, wake up dumbass, we have to try and fix this. As the last 3 functioning spirits in this storyline, it's kind of up to the bite victim, Cassidy, and Charlie to try and fix all of this. Luckily for them, the bite victim has a lot of weird properties on the account that he's sort of cut in half. So now, for whatever reason that they never tried to do before, they all start working on Happiest Day. Honestly, I consider that one of the biggest plot holes in all of FNaF is that for some reason they never worked on this until this point. Like, that's a problem with every timeline. I don't know why the spirits take this long to reach this point. Like, Jake in the Stitch Racingers was just able to do it as soon as he learned it was possible. So I genuinely have no clue what the rules are here that prevent them from just moving on whenever they want. But whatever, the plot has to plot, I guess. This brings us to FNaF World, where Charlie and or Cassidy work on sort of laying out the structure where we can guide this lost part of his soul back to the other kids. This in turn allows him to help them, as well as get himself prepped for himself to move on. With most of the kids moving on, you only have that little bit of power remaining in Charlie, who just sort of drifts and falls slower than the others, and you have Cassidy choosing to stay behind. Now, why would that be the case? Well, we're missing a lot of context with Cassidy as it is, so this is going to be more on the speculation side than even the rest of the video. I want to cover this main idea in another video down the road, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that Golden Freddy is a character that knows about Andrew when most characters don't. Well, that would make their appearance at the end of Ultimate Custom Night something closer to the theory you see in Descent, the idea that Golden Freddy is watching the events of Ultimate Custom Night happen. Now, some incarnations of that theory have them trying to save Andrew, or prevent Ultimate Custom Night from happening, or trying to force it to end early, but I wouldn't quite say that just yet. Instead, let's say this is more something like Cassidy just trying to make sure Andrew doesn't screw it up, or doesn't hurt himself, or get other people hurt, or just being curious what will happen next. Think of Cassidy's new arc as sort of New Game Plus, the Old Man Consequences minigame showing that they can move on anytime they would choose to. However, as long as there's still conflict out there, they're not quite willing to. This is kind of what Ultimate Custom Night's ending is showing us. As Ultimate Custom Night scales up further and further and becomes more deranged and insane as Andrew starts pulling in new characters and weird scenarios and the fundamental binds of everything breaks more and more, Golden Freddy continues to twitch on and just watch as the madness unfolds. And then this would connect back to Fetch. Why is Golden Freddy in Fetch? They're continuing to follow and watch Andrew to see what happened to him after the events of Man in Room 1280. And potentially, if Scott wanted to keep around one legacy character for the Steel Wool and sort of Mimic arc, saying Golden Freddy stuck around after seeing what's going on with the Mimic and Glitch Trap is a decently reasonable excuse. Enough time to segue into the Glitch Trap plotline and so on. That, or unlike the original Stingers, Golden Freddy will play some involved part in this new Stitchline updated storyline. It's hard to say, but keeping Golden Freddy around does open up new plot possibilities, and that probably is what Scott was going for. There's way too much weight placed on the bite victim being in Happiest Day or being connected to Happiest Day for it to not happen. However, at the same time, we only saw the 6 kids, so either you have to make some weird justification for him not being there visually, which is kind of a letdown given the series is pretty good about giving us a big finale where the souls fade into light or vanish or the mask drop. Or you just say, screw it, one of the kids was unaccounted for. And why not do it with one that people want to know more about, a character who's kind of a blank slate, because we never really developed the unique traits of Golden Freddy prior to this point. We did with Charlie in FNaF 6, we gave some of the bare bones characterization of the bite victim from FNaF 4, and Scott seems to be allergic to giving the main 4 kids other than Susie characterization, but does consistently give the 5th missing kid characterization, which would just mean Scott's just kind of righting a wrong that he never got around to in the original story. Oops, we kind of ran out of time to develop Golden Freddy, so Golden Freddy is going into overtime, don't worry about it. The fact that we are getting new information in the first place kind of gives me hope that this is going somewhere. That's why I'm willing to say Cassidy's just still out there, because like, why not at this point? Or maybe not, who knows, we'll all have to see. Though with all that said, I don't think I have much more to say about Golden Freddy, the bite victim, or Cassidy, or anything to do with this damn yellow bear. Bye.